So good evening, everybody. We have simultaneous translation
Bonsoir, nous avons une
by
interprétation
Roger
simultanée.
Kaminker.
L'interprète s'appelle Roger Kaminker.
And whoever wants to,
Et si
ceux qui
vous,
veulent prendre le
and if you
traduction en
wish
français, ils se
to
mettent sur
listen to the
le
French
lien
interpretation, you
traduction.
simply have
et ils le
to
trouveront.
go down to interpretation and select.
I thank Professor Uzi Rabi,
Je voudrais
our
remercier
speaker,
le professeur
to join
Uzi
us.
Rabi
I
qui s'est joint
wish
à
well
nous.
to Jacob Loeb, who is the president of the
Aussi,
Swiss Friends of Tel Aviv
Jacob
University.
Loeb,
And we are very glad
et nous sommes très
section
heureux
of Geneva to join with such
de travailler entre ces deux
institutions in
institutions
organizing this event.
pour organiser cet événement ce soir.
I will let
Je voudrais
ambassador to start.
demander à l'ambassadeur de
And then we
commencer.
want
Ensuite,
to hear
je
Professor Rabi.
vous dirai quelque chose et ensuite nous passerons au professeur Uzi Rabi tout de suite après.
Good evening, everybody, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen.
Bonsoir tout le monde, amis, mesdames et messieurs.
I'm
Je
very
suis
happy to welcome all of you
heureux de vous
to the lecture
souhaiter
of
la
Professor
bienvenue
Rabi,
à la conférence du professeur Rabi,
the distinguished professor
le
from the Tel Aviv
professeur
University,
distingué de l'université de Tel Aviv.
and he will talk about Israel and the Middle East in 2021.
Il va nous parler d'Israël et le Moyen-Orient en 2021.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Je vous remercie de vous être joint à nous.
One thing is sure, there is no dull moment,
Il y a
never
une chose
dull
qui est
moment in
certaine,
the Middle East.
il n'y a jamais de moments qui ne sont pas intéressants au Moyen-Orient.
And as I heard Professor Rabi before, I
Et
know
comme j'ai déjà entendu parler le professeur
that
Rabi,
you will have an exciting
c'est pertinemment que vous allez avoir
And
entendre une conférence très
Professor Rabi, as I said, is
intéressante.
teaching and researching in Tel Aviv University, which is one of the centers of excellence in Israel, in the Academia of Israel. It has numerous contacts with the Swiss universities and research institutes, and have a joint research and exchanges with many of the academic institutes in Switzerland. This is just part of the great scientific and research cooperation between our two countries, Switzerland and Israel. And this is a good opportunity to thank the Swiss-Israel Friendship Association, its president, Corinna Eichenberger-Walter, its secretary general, Valo Blum, for the wonderful support for Israel and for their tireless efforts to bring our two countries closer together. Thank you, dear friends. And of course, Yoel Herzog, the head of the Swiss Roman Association of Friends of Israel, and a close friend of mine, who is very pivotal for organizing this event today. Thank you very much, Yoel.
Thank you.
And thank you, Patrick Le, president of the Tel Aviv University Swiss Friends, Miss Ilanit Kessel from Tel Aviv University, Mr. Alain Picard, and the team of the Embassy of Israel in Bern for organizing this event. Thank you and enjoy the lecture, and I'm sure you will.
Thank you, Jacob. Thanks, Joel. I mean, first of all, good evening, everybody from Israel. It is
maybe Yoel will introduce you.
Okay, sorry. Please, Joel.
I would like to thank all of you to participate in this event. We have a nice participation, and I would like to thank Professor Uzi Rabi and the Swiss Friends of Tel Aviv University who have been at our disposal. We are very proud to join with the embassy and the university in order to present Israel and the Middle East in 2021 by Professor Uzi Rabi. If one would search for a real connoisseur of the Middle East and its intricacies, we couldn't have found a better one. And Professor Uzi Rabi is the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern and African Studies, professor of Middle East History at the Department of Middle East and African Studies in the Tel Aviv University, a senior researcher at the Center for Iranian Studies, which is an important issue. And he is also the director of the Tel Aviv University workshop, an annual 10-day seminar for international scholars that focuses on geopolitical situation of Israel and its neighbors, and co-authors Bustan, the Middle East Book Review. He has recently published his book, Return of the Past, State, Identity, and Society in the Post-Arab Spring Middle East. He is consulted by the Israeli administration regularly, by NATO, by the the European Union, and I'm sure you'll find it fascinating to hear from somebody who really understands the complications in the Middle East. Just to add that those of you who have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and at the end, Patrick Loeb will collect the best questions and we'll try to pass as many as we can, and Professor will reply. Coming to our day-to-day activities in the Swiss-Israel Association, this conference is meeting a text which our national vice president, Jean-Auguste Nehru, and myself published in Le Temps, which is an important newspaper here. And it spoke exactly about the change of paradigm in the Middle East, because unfortunately in Switzerland until now, everybody is stuck still in the old paradigm. And you read in the newspapers criticism because anything that comes from Trump is not kosher. So they are still living in a different world to what is really happening. And that's why I think it's very important to hear and elaborate on it. We also have a lot of problems with Le Temps, who published a very nasty attack on the foreign minister of Switzerland on 4 pages. I never saw it in my life. In Le Temps, 4 pages consecrated to one subject, playing on the issue of UNRWA, because the foreign minister said that UNRWA is part of the problem and not part of the solution. And they have used it in a very nasty way, which is not to our liking. The political parties naturally are dealing with a political problem within Switzerland, but we do not like it. And there will be 2 documents published today or tomorrow by the embassy, and I thank them for that. One on the cabal which was created as to the vaccinations to the Palestinian population, and the other on the question of UNRWA, since it admitted finally, after 5 years that we are insisting and asking them, and they have denied it, that their school curriculum and school books are teaching to hate and to edification of terror, which is not really something that European taxpayers who are paying for it should be happy about. So this is what we are doing. Whoever is interested, we are looking for people who are prepared to write letters to the newspapers when there is something to be said. And we are looking for more members, and because we are facing important fights ahead, because unfortunately the situation requires it. So I thank you very much, and I wish Professor Rabi a very nice talk, and pass him the floor. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Joel. Thanks, Jacob. I mean, it's a real pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. And what I would try to do in my short presentation is to exchange some views with you about the Middle East what we call our ever-changing region. And in the beginning of 2021, it seems that the Middle East is really experiencing a change that in many ways is unprecedented. We do stand here a decade after the Arab Spring. We have seen a lot, states that were ruined, other states that were trying, like Tunisia and Egypt, to grab something from the protest and to create kind of a different ruler-rule relationship. In Egypt, to no avail. In Tunisia, some would say that this is a real attempt to start something that looks like democracy. But in the end of the day, when it comes to the Middle East as a whole, what we have seen in this decade is a lot of agony. What I stand to argue is that during the decade, some Arab states managed to have kind of a rethinking of where or what their position is regarding the ever-changing region. Many questions that had a very ultimate answer in the 20th century were now responded differently. What I'm going actually to be assisted by is kind of a short PowerPoint through which to just, again, as I said before, share with you what we do have in our region. Of course, this is the same Middle East. How surprisingly, I mean, if you look at the map, this is the same map almost that was created 100 years ago exactly. When it comes to states like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, all of them were created by the British and the French. And that was kind of an outcome of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Basically, we are still there when it comes to the formalities. But if we're going to look at what happened in the last decade, we would understand how deep the change is. Have a look here. This is Iran, this is Turkey. Two non-Arab players who in the recent decades developed a huge appetite with which to reclaim their hegemony in this region. So the first process to be talked or dealt with is this equation where the Arabs, the prominent player in the 20th century, became that weak, and much of the void that was left behind is being filled in by ambitions and pretensions coming from both Iran and Turkey, as I said before, non-Arab players. The problem with Iran is that from 1979, it is an Islamic republic. And this revolution is, from then on, was trying actually to expand Iranian hegemony in the region. I'll make a long story short. But when it comes to the recent decade, and especially the last one, when it comes to the agony of the Middle East with Arab states being fallen into the cracks, Iran managed to capitalize on that. And what happened, in a nutshell, is sort of a crescent. This is how Arabs actually depict that. In Arabic, it is Al-Hilal al-Shi'i, Shiite crescent. To make a long story short, this is Iran. Here is Iraq after the downfall of Saddam Hussein. Iran has managed to capitalize on the ruins of Iraq. Here is Syria, and Iran is here too, as we know, still since the Arab Spring actually was to embark. And Lebanon, this is an old story. Iran from the 80s sent sort of a satellite named Hezbollah in order to capitalize, as I said before, on a miserable Arab state, to Shiitize, because in Lebanon, in Iraq, and in Syria to some extent, you have Shi'i components. And what Iran actually did is to create kind of a state within a state in those three states, thereby creating a continuum from the Gulf to the eastern flank of the Mediterranean. Now, that was very, very problematic in the eyes of many, many Arab states like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, even the Sultanate of Oman to some extent. But this is the story. Iran is becoming very, very dominant, very pretentious, capitalizing on the weakness of Arab states, and there is no connection whatsoever. What is the internal situation in Iran? Iran actually is looking at its regional adventure as a bargaining chips for a rainy day. And this is why they are not going to give up on that. Later, they actually penetrated Yemen here by coming through the Indian Ocean. This is also something of a real concern when it comes to Saudi Arabia, even Israel. Because what Iran has managed to do is to come up with kind of a missile industry. And this is why I think that when it comes to what we call the Middle East, the Gulf of Aden, the eastern flank of the Mediterranean, Iran has managed to present itself, and the architect was Qasem Soleimani. And as you know, a year ago, more or less, actually, he was killed by the Americans, but he managed to have this whole orchestra in the Middle East. And what we have here is not what we see in this map, okay? Because many Arab states, actually, as I said before, are being taken captive by Iran, and this has become a source of concern for many Arab states. The other concern actually came from Turkey. Recep Erdogan, again, another tough nut with kind of a megalomania, trying to reclaim whatsoever Turkish hegemony in the region and beyond. And he became the champion of a very strict Sunni thinking. Iran is Shiite. We move to the Sunnis. I mean, he has supported the Muslim Brothers, a very pious and puritanical Sunni player that managed to rule Egypt for a year under Muhammad Morsi, if you remember. Hamas is also an offshoot of the Muslim Brothers. And Erdogan is the champion, being assisted by Qatar, a state from the Arab Gulf. And while looking at all these, what we have to make sure is that he became another concern, real concern for many Arab states. Because what he tried to do is to undermine monarchies in the Gulf. What he tried to do is to just be there when it comes to Syria. Look at this. This is kind of a security zone, which is handled by Turkey in order to be there and smash Syrian Kurds, and once and for all have a foothold in the northeastern flank of Syria. I am taking you far away. This is Libya, another failed state. Here is the government of Tripoli, which is at loggerhead with the government of Benghazi in Libya. Erdogan supports Tripoli in order to get kind of an access to the water of the Mediterranean, in order to bring in some obstacles when it comes to a Mediterranean cooperation or a Euromed cooperation between Israel, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt, and others. So those two states, Iran and Turkey, not to mention some lunatics that 5 years ago managed to build up a state for their own at the heart of the Middle East. I'm talking about ISIS. Made some of the Arab states rethink of their or how to foster their future strategy. What I'm trying to say here is that guys like Mohammed bin Zayed, this is the heir of the United Arab Emirates. One would say even Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, Saudi Arabia, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, the king of Bahrain, all of them came up with a different calculus that in the Middle East was unprecedented. The calculus was pretty simple. There was a different answer to the almighty question of who my enemy is. When Arabs asked that question in the 20th century, there was an ultimate answer as to who your enemy is. It has been always Israel. Well, these states now, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, even Morocco, Bahrain, and knew for sure that maybe Israel is not their cup of tea, so to speak, but Israel is definitely not their enemy. When you have a bunch of enemies like Iran and Turkey and Salafi jihadists, I mean ISIS and Al-Qaeda, you know that you have to really think of how you're going to proceed from here. Those states jump to the conclusion that if they would like actually to have kind of a chance to freely move in the 21st century and to bring in some fresh start, they have to change immediately their orientation, stop paying lip service to all these slogans that in the 20th century came to nothing. And this is exactly what we have seen here. Paradoxically, in the midst of the Arab Spring, not because something Israel did or even the United States. What happened is that Arab states actually came to the conclusion that here are our enemies. It is Iran, by all means and purposes. It is Turkey, which is trying to undermine our basic post. It is, of course, actually the radicals. And what happened here is something that was seen in 2015, 2016 in those states. What they began singing, so to speak, is kind of a cry for a more moderate Islam, a more tolerant Islam, accepting the other. Well, maybe it was pretty artificial because it came from above. But here is the thing. Implicitly in it, there was also a call to the West if you would like, actually, if you think of having a different Middle East, it would be worthwhile to help us out in our fight against the radicals. Don't make the same mistake by which to talk to us, waving the flag of human rights, and forget actually who is who in the Middle East. Having said that, I have to add, we do talk to many young people in the Middle East, day by day. I can assure you that there are many dreams there. People are dealing with the civil stuff, not the nationalistic, not the transnationalistic. This is a real change, but it will take some time for the medium run. On the long run, to see actually what comes up with this, let's say, process, which is very, very interesting, socio-politically speaking, socio-economically. Of course, actually, we have a lot of changes here, but I would like actually to take you to the geopolitical fold. Look at the Abraham Accords. Don't make mistake. This is not the same as was the peace between Israel and Jordan or Israel and Egypt. With all respect, the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt was of a historical meaning. 1979, I'll just remind you. But looking at what happened in the Abraham Accords, there was kind of a multi-layer understanding that Israel could be the enemy of my enemy. So the bottom line is, could be actually a collaborator with me against the same enemies. But I think that it is more than that, more than the geopolitical stance, which is pretty important. I mean, those states actually came up with a different calculation also when it comes to their, let's say, future, economically speaking, technologically speaking. What we have to take note about is that these states are oil states. They know one way or the other that oil is not going to stay there for long. They know what renewable energies are. And they got the sense that Israel is sort of a laboratory. While linking yourself to, you can actually have many, many benefits. Of course, Israel is going to be benefited too. It's a mutual thing, but it is based on not only the geopolitical, the mere geopolitical thinking. What we got here is kind of a different understanding that Israel is not only not an enemy, it could be a partner when it comes to the, let's say, actually what lies ahead in the 20th century. Military technology, high military technology, kind of, let's say, fighting or challenging with the would-be viruses on top of Corona. This is part and parcel of the 21st century. So the notion was pretty clear. If we're gonna deal with it together, geopolitically speaking, technologically speaking, economically speaking, and we are going actually to soften up our language, not letting religion, which we do respect, not letting religion penetrating the political fold and be used as a vehicle by which to smash the whole process of state building. So Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is not a pure Democrat. He's an autocrat. The guys from the Gulf are autocrats. But they have managed actually to understand what the problem is. And in 2021, we have kind of a golden opportunity. This is high time to give a hand to that effort in order to build in the Middle East kind of a camp that for the outset, or from the outset, sorry, would talk differently about the radicals and would act differently. And what we have seen in Egypt is Muslim brothers are outlawed. The same is in United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and so forth. What we do see here is kind of a different listening to the public. Not democracy, not full-scale change, but gradually. These autocrats are bringing in something that would make the public or leave the impression that they are doing something for the public. Well, it's a lot easier to do that when you have a lot of money, like United Arab Emirates, maybe Bahrain or Qatar, Saudi Arabia. It is very difficult to do that in Egypt, but once again, look at Egypt. Where the problem is. The problem is the neighbor, Libya, a failed state, which had been fallen into the cracks. And what Egypt has to do is to make sure that thousands of kilometers of border with Libya are being secured. Look what happened in Ethiopia, the origins of the Nile, less water, less and less, are going to be poured into Egypt. This is definitely, and I'm quoting Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, this is a casus belli. We have so many problems here, water problems. We have those viruses. We have the problems with the smashed economies, hunger. So I think that rulers and ruled together in different rhythms are becoming closer and closer to the understanding, to the internalization of the simple fact that the civil stuff is much more important than the transnational ideological stuff that for ages actually were the main pulse in the Middle East. And we do see that. And let me give you that, even the Arabs in Israel, Palestinians, even they are having a lot of complaints against their own leaders, saying something like, you have neglected the civil agenda. And we would like you to deal with our problems. With all respect to the Palestinians, because they are Palestinians too. All these complexities came to the fore and made us think on our ever-changing region as a region where you have those changing equations and you don't have time. What you have to do is to adequately learn day by day what the change is. Adapt yourself to the changing circumstances. Create something that would be fit for your particular agenda. Carefully listen to the other. Respect him for his otherness. But make sure that you know something about his culture, history, language, and you can imagine, at least partially, how he or she there do memorize themselves. This is what we are doing in Tel Aviv University in the Dayan Center. What we are trying to create for Israel is a bunch of experts, young students, who I hope are going actually to lead the way when it comes to expertise of the Middle East, which is so crucial for Israel in the 21st century. Why? Because there are pros and cons. Why? Because if Israel is clever, wiser, it could be benefited from what's going on in the Middle East. And with God's will, if all these young people who went through the corridors of the Arab Spring and finally understood, not all of them, of course, but a real portion of them, a great portion of them, if they are going to coming up with the banners of civil society, the civil needs of a society, talk to me about job opportunities, talk to me about the hope for a different future, talk to me about my kids and their future. This is what I would like to hear. So we have kind of I would say kind of a bunch of sounds coming from different quarters of the Middle East. There is no one rhythm. There is no one recipe with which to solve all the problems. We know that. Syria is Syria, and I could talk to you about Syria in kind of a different presentation, in Libya, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran. Each state actually deserves kind of an in-depth examination. If you would like to have an idea of what we are doing, it is as if we do take the map of the Middle East and day by day, we map them out. The different players, the different voices, the leaders, the public, in order to make sure that we are still there, up to date. We are not coming up with slogans. We are not trying to pass a judgment on them while using our culture. All these things are being taught in our classes and research centers with the aim of course, of creating a bunch of experts who are going to be very instrumental, in my opinion, in the 21st century in Israel and the Middle East. I think, Joel, I'll stop here, and I would gladly actually have your comments and questions or whatever.
Thank you very much, Professor Rabi, for this very enlightening presentation. And of course, also thank you for also shed a little bit of light to what you're doing at the university. That's very important for us here as the Swiss friends. Now, please allow me to go straight into the questions we have so far. And I invite the public and the listeners to just use the Q&A section for further questions. I will go through them now, and if there are some similarities in the questions, of course, I will kind of pack them together. The first question comes from Mr. Ghani, and his question is the rivalry between Turkey and Iran giving some kind of hope that these two forces are kind of neutralizing each other? And on top of that, how would Iraq fit into that picture?
Well, I mean, this is very, very important. I mean, I think that there is definitely a rivalry between both of them. Why? Because both of them are aiming at the same spot, hegemony in the Middle East. The problem is that, as I said before, there are many, many other factors that came to the fore. Let's just make sure that while going into Iraq, I would show you how a slice of Iraq was swallowed up by Turkey, and a slice of the same Iraq is being swallowed up by Iran. If we're going to go to Syria, almost the same. A slice of Syria being swallowed up by Turkey, and the other slice is being swallowed up by Iran. This is kind of a thing which is very, very sad, because these states who are becoming so weak and become failed states cannot get out from this fiasco, because what we got here inside or in the states is a bunch of both regional and international powers. And we should not forget, after 200 years, America is not in anymore. Yes, they are going to deal with the Iranian file. We know more or less actually what would be the end game of the Biden administration when it comes to the nuclear file. They say it, I don't have to say even that. But Russia is the boss. China is very, very present. Maybe not geopolitically, but economically speaking, this is becoming a giant. And you know, I mean, this economic might be translated into geopolitical one. It's just a matter of time. So after 200 years, we don't see the West in the Middle East anymore. And you know, if you go through the 19th century, 20th century, that was the rule. Where is the West? The West was so dominant in the Middle East. The problem with Iran and Turkey that each one is sticking to its particular agenda. They have more often than not ad hoc alliances because they have also the same rivals. But I do agree that behind the corner, there is kind of a rivalry between both of them. And this is something that should be inserted to the calculus and being capitalized on or used when it comes to your regional calculus. Definitely, Iran and Turkey are, you know, both tough nuts. I mean, each one of them is very, very ambitious, but luckily, they are not going actually to have things hand in hand. And one way or the other, there is kind of a rivalry here that I guess at a certain stage is going to be out on the floor and be seen by everybody.
You did mention already the big forces behind it. You mentioned Russia, the United States, and of course, China as an economic power. This brings me to, first of all, the question of Liora Hubani, who asks, how is the Biden administration, the new incoming Biden administration, fitting into this picture? And I believe not only when it comes to the Iran appeasement treaty, but also, or atomic treaty, I'm sorry, I used a non-technical verb here. So how do you think is the new administration playing into it? And one factor, please let me add that from my personal position, Europe should be a player as well. But I think for many, many years, we haven't seen them on the ground. And if so, in a very special role, supporting most probably only one of the players in the region. Is that a correct assumption, or how would you phrase it?
Well, that's a very good comment. I think that, yes, first of all, once again, I have to re-emphasize the fact that the United States, in my opinion, is very pale when it comes to the Middle East, because I don't think the Americans have real interest here anymore. Oil is not what it used to be when it comes to the American calculus. Even in the times of Obama and thereafter Trump, and now I think the Biden administration, this is not their first priority. They have some other stuff in other parts of the world, but mainly to deal with the problems within the states. What happened in the Corona days, the schism in the American society. So I think that this is going to be an administration which is not going to be too proactive in the Middle East. Of course, then there is an unsolved file. It is the Iranian file. And if to take what Blinken said yesterday or the day before, the Iranians are able actually in a couple of weeks to just reach the destination of nuclear weaponry. So it means that we have to have a deal, as we said before, because a deal actually brings in sort of a control about things. It creates sort of a postponement in the Iranian run to the nuclear weapon. Well, that might be true. The problem is that Iran is not going to give up on other things that are beyond the deal. Let me give you that. Actually, what about the missiles, ballistic missiles? What about the adventures all over the region? Make Arab states so miserable. Supporting terrorism all over the world. We know that. We know that. So, in my opinion, if you would like actually to reopen the 2015 deal and to deal with that seriously, you have to come up with a correlation by which to say, listen, I am ready to lift the sanctions, but it has to do with your behavior. Let's do that step by step. If I'm coming and say, hey, let's have a deal, I'm going to lift the sanctions. Well, this is something that Iran is thrilled to hear. And I don't think that this is the best way to deal with Iran, but let's wait and see. Maybe in the Biden administration, actually, there are some other people other than the Obama period who are going to have something which is more creative and more sophisticated. In the meantime, I would like to just deal with what you said about Europe. Yes, I think you are right. And this is my advice to Israel. You know, we don't have to antagonize the Biden administration. Whatever government we're going to have here after the election, we have to launch a diplomatic war to come up with all arguments in order to persuade the Americans not to heavily tilt towards the Iranians. I'm putting that way because this is the feeling when it comes to Israel, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and others. All these states have to come up with a united stance as to how to deal in Iran in kind of a more balanced manner. Even if at least actually to allay some of the fears and anxiety they do feel when they see what's going on. I would advise Israel to talk to France. You know, Macron was in Beirut. He was bewildered while seeing the carnage there and the explosion, if you remember, several months ago. He came up with kind of a direct attack on Hezbollah. And he said that this axis of Iran-Hezbollah must be dealt with, otherwise Lebanon and parts of the Middle East are not going actually to become normal. If we would like to get to business as usual or to get to normality or partial normality, we have to just nip in the bud when it comes to this Iranian-Hezbollah axis. Nip it in the bud. We have to cut it because this is something that is very poisonous for a more stable Middle East. So, you know, I mean, I fully agree with you. We have to play with the cards, and we have actually to talk to Europeans, and we have to talk to Arabs, and Arabs should talk to us and to Europeans. And we have to build kind of a stance that would be pretty respectable, elegant, but very assertive, with which to come to the Americans and say, hey, I mean, we do understand that you would like to have a deal. That's okay. What sort of a deal are you going to have? Is this a deal that is going to improve our monitoring acts against Iran, or simply actually let Iran go on with its, you know, all these adventures? Well, I think that this is what Israel should do. Maybe Europe should come up with that, because Europe has many problems as well. And you know that much of the problems Europe has now is part and parcel or kind of a byproduct of never understanding the Middle East, never doing in the Middle East what should have been done before in order actually to bring in opportunities to those people, to in advance prevent these whole waves of refugees in times of crisis. Well, it's too late for that. But I think that if we would like to have kind of a partial stability in the Middle East, which is very important for Europe, of course, for Middle Easterners, we have to do whatever we can in order to do that. And unfortunately, the United States is not there, I guess, in real presence, as was the case before. And we have actually to create some other combinations and to talk to the Russians, maybe. I mean, they have also their own agenda, but my experience tells me that if you know how to talk to the Russians, you can be benefited. Of course, this is a different way of talk. It's a different culture. But once again, actually, this is what I tried to say. You have so many hands, so many orientations in the Middle East. You have to make sure that you know who is who and adapt yourself in face of the changing circumstances.
It's one way of doing that, coming up with, let's say, a project, let's say a dream project of a defense alliance of Arab states and Israel, modeled after, let's say, NATO?
Well, I once actually depicted that as an Arab-Israeli NATO. I'm not sure actually that this is the best analogy, but I agree with you one way or the other when it comes to the bottom line. Israel is going to support Gulf states when it comes to the military high technology, when it comes to bolstering their position, when it comes to the geopolitical fold, of course, exchange of intelligence. And I said before, there are many important folds when it comes to technology, economy. So this cooperation, in my opinion, has kind of a future, even a promising future. We do see that in the university. The simple fact that I have already got 2 PhD students who are Emiratis doing a PhD research in Tel Aviv under my supervision. This tells me that this is totally different. And this is my impression when we talk to Emiratis, talk to Bahrainis, when they talk to us. I mean, in a way, there is no enmity. Maybe there is no full intimacy, but actually everybody is respecting the other. We do things together at all 4 walks of life. And I do hope that this would be something to move forward from in the Middle East. Definitely.
This brings us to Saudi Arabia, I believe. And we have questions from Mr. Ingram and Ms. Arki. They effectively want to know, is Saudi Arabia really a moderate state, as you pictured it? If yes, how is, again, the Biden administration fitting into that picture, where we all know that the new US administration will look quite skeptical at the, especially the human rights elements?
Well, it's a very good question. If the impression that I left behind is that Saudi is a moderate state, so let me take it back. I mentioned Saudi Arabia is part and parcel of this bloc, Arab-Israeli bloc, that came up with a new geopolitical calculus. Saudi Arabia today is being run by a guy aged 35. He's the heir. His name is Mohammed bin Salman. The Americans actually depict him as MBS. Well, this guy is very cruel. He's an autocrat. But if I may, I dare name him as kind of an autocrat or a dictator who is coming up with some I would say, new methods in order to deal with the problems. This is the guy who was first to come and say that what Iran is doing in the Middle East is what Hitler did in the Second World War. This is the guy who was very hasty even to do a sort of a horror with the Adnan Khashoggi, who was kind of a Saudi guy who, according to the Saudis, he supported the Muslim Brothers, but he found his death by a Saudi agent in the consulate in Istanbul. This guy, Mohammed bin Salman, has managed actually to put his 200 princes, actually part of his family, in kind of a siege until they would persuade that supporting him is the thing. So I'm not talking about moderate rulers as it is. I'm talking about rulers who are much more sophisticated, who came to understand and realize that they have problems with Iran and Turkey. They don't want actually radicals in their country like ISIS and Qaeda, and they changed the whole thing. At the same time, they are trying actually to make it up to their own public, you know. And when it comes to the Saudi public, we actually interviewed many Saudis, some of them very, very young, who said loud and clear that we do have some modifications when it comes to the women's right in Saudi Arabia. Of course, relatively speaking, this is kind of a gradual revolution in Saudi terms. The Saudis, as everybody knows, are a very, very pious and Puritan when it comes to their origin. They were built up on the Wahhabi creed, and there was an alliance between the Wahhabis, Beit al-Sheikh and Beit Saud. I don't want to delve into too many details about that. This is history, but this is very important. When it comes to the Saudis, please take note that these guys, Mohammed bin Salman, not his father, by the way, and this is why I think he is very hesitant while talking about normalization with Israel, because this is against the will of his father and the uncles. If his grandfather, Ibn Saud, the founder, would have known what he's doing, he would be bewildered. El Al airliners, Israel airliners are crossing the Saudi desert on their way to Abu Dhabi. This is more than normalizations in Saudi terms. So everything should be analyzed proportionally. After having got kind of a sense about the culture, the Saudis, Saudi, let's say, history and culture and society, this is a so complicated state. This is an enigma, Saudi Arabia. I wrote a book on Saudi Arabia. I can tell, I mean, this is, you know, many, many times you find yourself in junctures where you can't actually say an ultimate or come up with an ultimate conclusion. Saudi Arabia is, you know, it is both tradition and sort of a modernization when it comes to the technology, when it comes to the industry, when it comes to the oil, when it comes to all these things. How are you going to combine them? And you have to have that kind of a dance, a Saudi dance. It is as if while moving forward to the future, you should have a permit from the past to do so. Otherwise, you're going to live behind many enemies. So it's a kneeling and dealing day by day between different times. Present and past are dialoguing among themselves on how to foster the future. Quantum leap forward in Saudi terms, this is something which would be very difficult, not doable. And this is why we do see under these terms kind of an advancement in Saudi Arabia. And of course, this is a very cruel state. They know definitely who the enemies are. they are making mistake, and I do agree with you when it comes to the Biden administration. Everybody is holding the file of Khashoggi. The same thing actually can be said about Abdel Fattah al-Sisi with human rights. But once again, if we are going to pass judgment on these guys 100% while using the agenda of human rights, we are going to miss something which is very important here. There is a struggle in the Middle East between states that have decided actually to minimize the negative influence of radical religion. And they must be helped out at this stage. Even if they are not kind of well-established Democrats, even if they are not coming up with the agenda of full civil rights and human rights, of course, we should hope that this would happen in the Middle East. But as I said before, this is not something to be brought in from the West. This is something to be emerged from within. And the hope is those young people who do think that there is kind of a different agenda to follow, not the, I would say, not the archaic, agenda that used to be here in the 20th century. And this is, for me, a glimpse of hope, definitely.
Professor, we have another 27 questions, and I believe we're going to run out of time. So first of all, to the audience, please do not ask more questions because we won't have enough time to answer them. And again, I tried to bring some new aspects into the Q&A session. There are, of course, many questions about Iran and Israel and about the influence of the Biden administration. I believe we can probably skip it here. And one interesting aspect I saw here on the question section comes from Professor Picard, Jacques Picard, who asks, what are the potentials to get into an interplay alliance with the Turks for Israel? And on top of it, and here Iran comes again, I believe he has a dream looking into the long-term future. The same question about Iran.
Well, this is a dream everybody is share, especially people of Arab and Persian origin, at least partially like myself. And I know the stories of Israel and Iran before 1979. Iran was ruled by a monarch, Shah in Farsi, which is a king, and he was pro-Western. Israel and Iran then had close relations in many walks of life. But when the Ayatollahs came in 1979, they, from the beginning, from the outset, wanted to make sure that everybody knows that they are the pure opposite of the Shah. And what they did is to take Israel and the United States, was, the Shah's allies, and to say we are the opposite. For us, Israel and the United States is a diabolic axis. And they had the, Shi'i vocabulary to come up with all these slogans against America and the United States. On the one hand, I say never. But when it comes to this regime in Iran, Ayatollahs and revolutionary guards, in Aramaic we say Saifa and Safra, the book and the sword. This is the alliance that we do see in the Islamic Republic of Iran. When it comes to that regime, I don't believe that they have whatever actually thinking or kind of a chance that they are going actually to change their attitude to Israel, because this is kind of an identity card of the regime. Anti-Israelism, anti-Americanism, anti-Westernism, This is something that is part and parcel of the identity of the regime. Now, having said that, I must tell you, there are many Iranians that hate this regime, haven't had any problem with Israel and the United States, but they don't set the tone. The tone is being set by those cruel, cynical leaders of Iran. So I can't believe that this is something which is in the offing. As to Erdogan, this is a different opera, because the guy is very, very smart, politically speaking, and he plays the cards in kind of a way that would be at times very, very, very problematic. I mean, he came up 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago with something by which to say, hey, maybe we should rethink about some modifications with Israel. Of course, this has to do with the coming to the fore of the Biden administration. Everybody who was one way or the other being damaged by the Trump administration, and Turkey was actually sanctions were inflicted upon Turkey by the Biden administration too. Abu Mazen, when it comes to the Palestinians, came up with this balloon of elections, free elections in the West Bank, and everybody knows that this is just a lip service. Definitely, Hamas are not going to be allowed to take part in that. So, I mean, you have to take. This is what I suggest when it comes to the Middle East. Our tendency as human beings is to find kind of how should I put that? A kind of a formula with which to cover the whole problem of the Middle East and bring it kind of out of a sudden sort of a solution to all problems. Well, I mean, this is once again, I have to just re-emphasize that a bunch of orientations, so many hands. Believe me, there are states that you wouldn't understand actually who is who. How can we pass a judgment on that? The Middle East has become, in some areas, bits and pieces. In other quarters of the Middle East, as I said, there are some, I know, glimpse of hope when it comes to those Arab states, in my opinion, colliding or just cooperating with Israel. Iran is there, Turkey is there. United States is not there. The main problem is, how should I deal with my Middle East whenever I am Israel or Iraq or whatever, when for the first time I don't see any Westerners here? Try to think about that after hundreds of years. And how should Putin be talked to, or the Russians? What am I going to do with the Chinese? How am I going actually to compile all these without antagonizing this or that? We have different questions and different modus operandi. And this is why I think that states, have some leeway in order to adapt themselves, or keep some leeway in order to adapt themselves to the changing circumstances. I do hope that there would be kind of a change in the medium run or the long run, because what I see is the public actually having some other voices, and rulers who are still autocrats have to listen to the public because of the politics of survival. If those two vectors are going actually to come closer to each other, and we are going to have a middle of the road solution, this would be something wonderful for the Middle East. But that would take time.
Time is an issue here as well. So please allow me to ask you for one very short answer on the question of Mrs. Papo, because you just mentioned Putin. What is the project of Mr. Putin between Iran and Turkey? And then from there, just to announce to all of us here, the public, and you, Professor Rabi, I believe we should have another few minutes time for some light to be shed on the Palestinians. And on top of it, because we should not forget, Mr. Herzog is the chairman of the Swiss-Israel Friendship Association. We should probably also focus a little bit on the possibilities of a country like Switzerland.
Okay, so what you say, Patrick, is to deal first with the Russians with regard to the Iranians and the Syrians, then Israel and the Palestinians.
And then the Swiss on top, and then we end it here.
Okay, so the Russians have their own agenda. Don't forget they came to the Middle East because they were pretty worried that their investment in Al-Assad family is going to be ruined, and the alternative was ISIS. And don't forget that the Russians actually remembered what the ingredients of ISIS are. They know that from the Chechenian wars. They didn't want actually to have that in the stead of Bashar al-Assad in Syria and Iraq. And they knew if they are not going actually to cut it off in the beginning, they are going to get it thereafter in Central Asia. Now, the Russians are trying actually to handle Syria and to bring in kind of a situation where Syria is being recuperated with money coming from mainly the West, but from some Arab states. And Russia is going to be benefited from that economically and politically. I don't think Russia is going to leave the eastern flank of the Mediterranean because the port cities of Latakia and Tartus are wonderful spots actually to have kind of a say and a kind of a very, very good foothold when it comes to Middle East strategies and geopolitics. So the Russians are here to stay, in my opinion. The thing is that they are having a lot of problems in Syria. Why? Because they have the Turks, the Iranians, and the Israelis. Now, the Israelis would like to prevent Iran from having a foothold in the Golan Heights, Syrian Golan Heights. And they accommodated their activities with the Russians because they don't want to antagonize the Russians. The same goes to the Turks. I mean, we do see that back and forth, and it is as if actually, the Russians are having to deal with that until the moment that there is kind of a ceasefire, which is going to be, a little bit, relatively speaking, stable, as to actually come closer to the, all this architecture of recuperating Syria, which is, this is a real massacre, what happened there. I don't want to delve into that. But the Russians are becoming kind of a very important player when it comes to Libya too. So in my opinion, what the Russians have in mind is actually Mediterranean stuff. They have some economic ambitions when it comes to many spots in the Middle East. And of course, while looking at the Chinese, they have already actually purchased many ports in the Indian Ocean. So everybody is having his own map. China and Russia are going actually to be the main players here. We don't know actually what the Biden administrations or the Americans are going to do, but it seems safe to assume that the Americans are not going actually to be a too relevant player when it comes to Middle Eastern politics. Maybe I'm wrong, but let's see, actually, we should wait for that. But the whole equation has been changed dramatically in a short span of time. This is what we have to bear in mind. Now, the Palestinians. Well, first of all, Israel should deal with the Palestinians. And we have to find out a solution, a whatsoever solution. The Palestinians got kind of slap in the face because what happened recently in the Middle East is a normalization between Israel and Arab state. Without the notion that was there before, you cannot normalize relations with the Arab state, with an Arab state, if you are in Israel, before solving out the Palestinian problem. That was the axiom in the 20th century. It is no more valid. I'm not saying that Israel should do nothing with the Palestinians. First of all, Mahmoud Abbas is done. I don't think that we can do something else with him. I wish there would be, when it comes to the Fatah leaders, tough negotiators who are going actually to negotiate with Israel and to come to kind of a solution that would satisfy both sides. But the Palestinians should understand they have lost many bargaining chips they had had in hand 30, 20, and even 15 years ago. I'm not saying that they should actually be emptied from their ambitions, but this is a different situation. And we have to sit together. I think what we have to need is different leaders, maybe some younger leaders coming to the fore. Maybe that would be a kind of a wake-up call that this should be a Middle East where a problem should be solved out. I know that at least in Ramallah, in Jenin, from what I know and friends I have there, you know, Palestinians are suffering from a fatigue. Nobody actually has this whole thing of intifada, as was the case 20 and 30 years ago. Nobody. Even if the Palestinian leaders would call upon them to do that, nobody is going to come to the street and just protest against Israel. Some of them actually came to the conclusion that economic peace could be much more important than political or geopolitical peace. And I think that what I hear is some other, let's say, ideas coming to the fore. This is a new generation. It's not my generation. It's a new generation. It's my students' generation. And I do believe that they would talk differently. I hope that they will be educated in a different manner as to find kind of middle of the road solution or understanding or compromise. Because, you know, I mean, it is so tiny a territory, Israel and the Palestinians. If you look actually at this complex from above, you wouldn't believe actually that you have here two belligerents, so to speak. So the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that was once upon a time a master key for Middle Eastern politics is not anymore. Is not anymore. This is not anymore the case with it. But listen to that. Paradoxically, this would create much more possibilities, together with Gulf states, to find solutions that at least partially can satisfy both sides, especially the Palestinians, because together we can do great things. This is so simple as that. And I mean, I have a glimpse of hope. I do believe that in the future, we're going to see that. Not now. What we have now, we have Abu Mazen. He's still actually committed to the 48 thing. He doesn't say that, but he was born and suffered. He is the old guard. Well, it's not a matter how righteous you are or not. You have to deal with reality. And I think that there are greater chances after the Abraham Accords to come up with a partial solution for a start with the Palestinians than ever before. But again, we'll have to wait and see. We are in a transitory phase, that's for sure. I mean, leaders are going to be replaced. Some younger people are going to come to the fore. They are going to be equipped with stuff which is related to the 21st century. And this by itself would create a different rhythm. And one should hope that this by itself would also create kind of a different direction for the Middle East.
You were talking about economics, you were talking about students from the Gulf states within Tel Aviv University. Brings me to, and please, short answer to this probably kind of provocative question. Is the future leader of the Palestinian state a student of yours, or is it somebody of the family Masri, which is the richest family in Palestine?
No, I mean, you know, Palestinian leader could be, I don't know. I mean, they have so many candidates, and I talked about Fatah leaders, not my students. I mean, what I'm trying to say here is that, first of all, what we got here is younger people who do have some different ideas about the reality. I mean, they are going to be encouraged or pushed, either this or that, by, I think, a kind of a young society, or a society where the young people are going to prioritize the civil agenda over the nationalistic agenda. This is something you can see all over the place in the Middle East. And, you know, I do believe that if most people are coming up with the different priorities, and they do prioritize their civic agenda because they do care for themselves and their children and for the next generation, you know, they come up with different questions, they're going to get different answers. I mean, this is my hope. I'm not saying that this is the situation now. If you ask me, we have many, many problems now. But I do see some, or a sort of a nucleus of change, which has become an outcome, a paradox outcome of the Arab Spring and the Corona days. Don't forget that. You know, you and me know what Corona do to people. I mean, we can't actually stand uncertainty, and nobody can tell us what we're going to do with this pandemics. This is exactly what you have in the Middle East. Many people do talk to me and to my friends in the university and others, saying actually things that are related to the civic agenda. Why our health system is not that strong. Where are our physicians? Why did they run away? If you don't build up a healthy infrastructure and a steady process of state building, don't be surprised if in time of crisis, everything is being collapsed. This is exactly the conclusion. It's not mine. I say one thing, Patrick, just one thing. If people are coming up with self-criticism unheard of in the Middle East, and it is there. If people can come up with some bold questions, if people would like actually their leaders to provide answer as to the main things they promised and they didn't, it was not materialized. This is something that for me makes a change. Now, this change is not to be seen tomorrow in kind of a revolution, in kind of a democracy. But this is the beginning. This is what history tells us. This is the beginning of a very, very specific process, in the end of which we're going to have a different reality. And you know, history tells us that pandemics are to be understood as a wake-up call for societies to change many things that were taken for granted. So many things that were taken for granted on the individualistic level, on the communal level, on the state level, and the society level. But listen, I mean, you know, we have many problems, but for the first time, at least here and there, I do think that there is a glimpse of hope. Maybe I won't be privileged to see that in my lifetime, but I know that there is a chance that my maybe grandsons are going actually to enjoy a different atmosphere or climate in the Middle East. We pray for that.
To bring it to an end, let's go to the beginning of our broadcast webinar, where Mr. Herzog mentioned our foreign minister, Mr. Cassis, who had some quite strong ideas about UNRWA. And of course, you know that Switzerland, as a neutral country and host of the, when was it, in 96, I believe, or later, the Geneva Convention with the Palestinians, Switzerland having a tradition of supporting enemy states to come to a conclusion, or to help conflicts to end. Where is the role of a country like Switzerland in that conflict? How can Switzerland support, centralize a little bit the process?
No European country should be the initiator of peace. Peace is something, real peace, is something that can be made only when people to people do interact, and there is something that in a steady and in a gradual process is being emerged. If that is the atmosphere, states like Switzerland are very important as auxiliary wills. You know, you're going to support positive trends. You're not about to create them. This would be very artificial. You should not create something that is not there, because you have to deal with the reality. Now, if there is kind of a positive development, something that has to do not with the leaders talking to each other. I'm talking about people to people thing. This is what we hardly working on, to make sure that the students here would find actually and talk to the student there. If I know nothing about the other, how should I talk about the other? How should I understand him? It is exposing the other in order to create this people to people thing. Now, states like Switzerland are having a very crucial and instrumental role when it comes to support the positive march, not to create a positive, support the positive march. And this is why I say that from the out you can serve as an auxiliary will, not as kind of a fixer, not as kind of an initiator of solutions, because you know, you have to let them grow up with all these problems and come themselves to the conclusion that things must be changed for the sake of their children, for the sake of themselves. This is, in my opinion, what we do see in the Middle East, you know, here and there. But in my opinion, if Switzerland and other states in Europe would like actually to support the Middle East, they should serve as an auxiliary wheel to many, many projects that are there, but they are in the right direction. And for me, this is something which is very important, because without this support, we're going to lag behind. So, this is why I think that the assistance and the support of European states like Switzerland, when it comes to some positive trends, is so crucial and instrumental. But we have to be very patient. We shouldn't actually, throw what I would call aid packages. And I did my job, thanks God. No. You have to accompany actually these changes. You have to make sure that in the let us say educational system. And I can tell you that, you know what we checked in Saudi Arabia, in United Arab Emirates, in Bahrain? We checked the reading material of young students in elementary schools, pupils in elementary schools, and the intermediate school. You know what we found? We found that from 2016, those states stopped depicting Israel as the what they call in Arabic al-Kiyan al-Sahayoni, which means the Zionist entity. You know how they depict Israel? Israel, for us, that was a mere indication that a change is in the offing. And I think that we can do that elsewhere. Don't forget that other parts of the Middle East are suffering from a real shortage and poverty and stuff. And of course, the world should be there. Now the world actually has some other priorities, as we do see. But I think that states like Switzerland and others who are always there to submit the support should just be more choosy and ask themselves whether the support is being actually synchronized with a change in the educational level, in the societal, let us say, walks of life. And if you have kind of a scope which is being reckoned with, I think that this support would be very crucial and instrumental.
Professor Rabi, you mentioned that patience is a very important element here. I have to tell you that we are impatiently looking forward to the next webinar hosting you. I can tell you that I couldn't raise a multitude of questions raised by the audience. All I can say from my side as president of Tel Aviv University Swiss Friends, that I thank you very, very much for your presentation. I thank
my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you.
Let me thank our partners, represented here by Ambassador Kedar, who and his team, who supported us not only with input and the greeting, but also technically. Without the embassy, it wouldn't have been possible. Same goes to our friends in the Romandie, and here in particular to Monsieur Joël Herzog, le président de l'association d'amitié entre la Suisse et Israël. We had very many audience in the audience from the Romandie, and many questions came from there. And also thank you very much, Mr. Herzog, for providing the translation by Roger Kaminker, which I believe was excellent. So from here I end, and I'll give the floor back to Ambassador Kedar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Picard and Yoel and all the participants and the people who asked the wonderful questions. But most of all, I would like to thank Professor Uzi Rabi for this wonderful presentation, from which we learned quite a bit. And as you said, Mr. Picard, we are looking forward to the next presentation of Professor Rabi. It will be wonderful to hear him again. And I would like to thank also the Swiss-Israel Friendship Association, Yoel Herzog, and all our friends for their support and for their hosting this event together with us. So
thank you very much, Ambassador.
I wish everybody a good evening, and thank you again.
Good evening. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Patrick, and a great thank you to Professor Rabi, who really fascinated us with his wisdom.
Thank you, Carl.
Grateful.
Pleasure. Bye.
Bye-bye.